Hey, what's new and exciting? It's Kevin O'Shaughnessy here. In this video, I'm going to share with you why you may still have trouble dialing in good compressor settings and why it's probably not your fault. If you're new to the channel, again, my name is Kevin O'Shaughnessy. I'm an independent recording artist, music producer, and teacher, and I discuss performance, especially guitar. I also talk about music production and songwriting. And my goal is to help determined musicians such as yourself make better music more confidently by filling in gaps in knowledge between music and the tools used to make it. So let's talk compressors here. Now, I'm assuming you know what a compressor is, you know what the parameters are, and you've been having some trouble dialing in a good sound with a compressor, whether you're doing it on an individual track or your mix bus or whatever. If none of these things apply to you, this is not your video. You're more than welcome to stay and watch it until the end, but I'm basically looking for people who have been working with a compressor and having a hard time with it. So if that's you, stay tuned because I've got some stuff that'll probably help you out. For this video, I'm going to be focusing mostly on setting the attack and release times on a compressor because those seem to be the most confusing elements. So reason number one, you might be having trouble with these. Music operates in an environment of relativity. Compressors operate in an environment of absolutes. What do I mean by that? In music, we have a duration called a whole note. Most of you probably know that a whole note lasts for 4 beats. But the actual length in absolute time of that whole note is going to be based on the tempo of the song. If your tempo is 60 beats a minute, that's 1 beat per second, your whole note is going to last for 4 seconds of absolute time. If the tempo of the song is 120, that's 2 beats per second, then the whole note, that same whole note of 4 beats, is only going to last for 2 seconds of absolute time. More on that in a minute. Reason number 2 you might be having trouble with these parameters is that attack and release in music mean different things than attack and release in compressor land. So in music, the attack is the start of a note. Mix engineers typically refer to this as the transient. Okay, so in music, the attack can be hard or soft or pretty much anywhere in between. But hard or soft are the way we often describe it. It might be sharp or soft or things like that, but you get the idea. A percussion instrument or percussive instruments like acoustic guitar might have very hard attacks. You'll see this sort of as a spike at the beginning of each note. On the left side of the waveform if you're looking at it in a DAW. Whereas something like bowed string instruments like violins or cellos might have very soft attacks. You'll see the start of each note sort of swell up a little bit. So that's going to make a difference as to how you set your compressor. The release can mean a couple of different things. It's a term used to describe part of the song form in jazz. But it's also used to describe, you might have heard it with the concept of tension and release, where a group of notes sound very tense together, right? They're clashing, they're very dissonant, and by moving one or more of those notes, you resolve that tension, you release that tension into something that sounds more consonant and pleasant. In music synthesis, release is the stopping of a note, and that's probably what's going to be more important right now. Is attack in music is the start of a note, release is the end of a note. In compressor land, the attack is a delay time. It's a fixed time in milliseconds, and the release time is also a delay time. The attack time on a compressor tells the compressor how long after the note is attacked does the compressor attack. And the release time in a compressor is how long after the volume or the amplitude, as mix engineers will call it, how long after the signal dips down below the threshold does the compressor release and relax. Reason number 3. because of the relative nature of music and the absolute nature of compressors, we have a few variables to consider when setting them on individual tracks for that instrument and for the song. So one of those variables are the parameters of the plugin or the device itself. What is the slowest attack speed? What is the fastest attack speed? What is the slowest release time? What is the fastest release time? Mix engineers tend to refer to these things as a fast attack time, slow release time, or fast attack, fast release, or slow attack, slow release, or whatever. There's just those few combinations. So what is a fast attack time? What is a slow release time? Part of that is going to be dependent on the compressor you're using. I use a program called Digital Performer. It's got a few stock compressors. They're all very good, but they all have different parameters. On one, the fastest attack time is like 0.1 milliseconds, but the slowest attack time on it is only 10 milliseconds. I have another compressor, a multiband compressor. The fastest attack time is 10 milliseconds, and I forget how slow it goes. It goes ridiculously slow. So those parameters are going to have an effect as to whether or not I classify something as a fast attack or a slow attack. Another variable to consider is the length of time of the transient for each instrument. So of course, in mixing speak, a transient is the start of a note. In music speak, the attack is the start of the note. Getting confused yet? So the actual time of that attack is going to have an effect on how you set the compressor. For example, a snare drum or an acoustic guitar, which are obviously a snare drum is a percussion instrument, but an acoustic guitar is a percussive instrument, are both going to have very, very fast transients, probably under 10 milliseconds. So if you're setting a 10 millisecond attack time on a snare drum, that could be considered a slow attack because the snare drum transient itself is so fast. Now, if you are working with, say, a bowed instrument like a violin or a cello, where the attack of the cello is slow because it's a bowed instrument, so it takes a little while. It could be 50 or 60 milliseconds before the note actually gets up to full volume, in which case setting a compressor speed of 10 milliseconds would be a fast attack on that instrument, if that makes sense. The other variable to consider is the tempo of the song. Now again, music is relative, so the tempo of the song may affect a performer's interpretation of that song or moments in that song. So for example, if you have a slow song, an acoustic guitar player might really rake the pick across the strings. So as they're strumming these big chords, you're going to hear multiple attacks. It could take 50 or 60 milliseconds before the chord actually rings out itself. That's going to affect your attack time. A vocalist, kind of doing the same thing. We tend to think of consonants as being fairly quick transients, but if it's a slow song, they may try to get into it a little bit more, and they're going to milk those consonants. So that's going to have an effect on your attack time. But if the song is much faster, you don't have time. The performer doesn't have time to milk those moments. So they've just got to get in and get out and get to the vowel and get to the pitch as quickly as possible. So that can have an effect on your attack times. These things are also the case depending on the decay of the instrument itself. A snare drum might have a very fast decay rate. In other words, the amplitude drops sharply after the drum is hit, depending on how the drummer has muted the heads. If they've muffled the heads in a particular way, you could get a very, very short sounding snare drum, or if they've let everything ring, it could be a second or more. I've heard snare drums ring for a couple of seconds, so that's going to have an effect on your release time. Same sort of thing with with acoustic guitars or electric guitars. How they dampen the strings, how they silence the strings is going to have an effect on the release time. So with that in mind, let's talk about a couple of things that might help you set your compressor times to get a desired result. So as you probably already know, a compressor is meant to control the dynamic range of a signal so that the louds aren't quite as loud and the quiets aren't quite as quiet. So with that in mind, engineers over the years have come up with some very creative ways of using compressors to also shape the tone. Not only control the overall volume of the signal, but how to shape the tone, how to bring out different elements of that tone, of the different elements of that instrument, rather, excuse me. So let's say you're compressing a snare drum. It's very common to put compressors on drums, on just about everything at this point. But let's say you're compressing a snare drum. As I mentioned before, a drum is going to have a very fast attack. It's going to have a very sharp, very hard attack. So your attack time is going to be dependent upon two basic things. What do you want to emphasize? Do you want to emphasize the sound of the stick hitting the head or the ring of the drum after the stick hits the head? Okay, so let's say you want to do the first. Let's say you want to make sure that the attack comes out very, very clearly. So what you would want to do is you would want to set a slow attack time based on the fact that it's a snare drum and based on whatever parameters you have on the plug-in or hardware device that you're using. As I mentioned, the transient of a snare drum only lasts for about 10 milliseconds. So if you want that entire attack sound to come through, then you'd set it for 10 milliseconds. If you want to shave a little bit of that off to make it sound like it's a little bit more aggressive, then anything under 10 milliseconds will do the trick. A common practice for setting the release time is to time the release to the beat of the song or the tempo of the song. So if your tempo is 120 beats per minute, that means that each beat is worth 500 milliseconds. Remember, 1 second is 1,000 milliseconds. So each beat in this case would be 500 milliseconds. So you could set the release time to be 500 milliseconds. So in other words, once the decay of the snare drum drops below the threshold, it's going to be another beat before the compressor actually releases the sound entirely. So you might want to curtail that. You might want to make that a half a beat, 250 milliseconds. You might want to make it a quarter of a beat, which in that case would be 125 milliseconds. Okay, so you're going to set those parameters based on the tempo of the song, or at least that's a good starting point until you get to a point where you can hear the differences of these faster attack times, these faster release times, and the slower attack and release times. Again, based on the parameters of the plugin you're using and the instrument or the signal that you're trying to compress. Let's say you want to do the other way around. Let's say you want to bring out the ring of the snare drum a little bit more. Well, then you basically do the opposite. You're going to set your attack time to be as fast as possible, okay? The snare drum attack is less than 10 milliseconds, so you pretty much want to set that thing as close to 0 as the plugin will allow. And your release time will probably only be about 10 or 15 milliseconds because you want the ring to come through. You want to compress the volume of the attack to allow the ringing of the snare drum after the fact to stand out. By turning one part of the sound down, you effectively raise the volume of the next one. And of course, the output gain will allow you to boost the overall output of the compressor so that you get a sound that sits in your mix much better. Now, if you're working with a vocalist, the same sorts of things apply. You want to listen to the consonants, especially the hard consonants, all of your plosives, your T's, your P's, all that kind of stuff. But you also want to listen to how they handle S's. A lot of singers will sit on an S for kind of a long time. And sometimes they'll use it for dramatic effect. Sometimes they don't know that they're doing it. So in the recording phase, you can either call that to their attention, or you can set your attack and release times that sort of split the difference between the very hard consonants, like the T's and the K's and that kind of thing, and those extended consonants like the S's and such. Kind of split the difference in terms of time. You could go so far as to actually measure it out in the DAW and look at it and find out how many milliseconds it is. But experimenting is probably a good way to do it as well. Just record as much as you can possibly record and play around with the times until you hear what sound gives you the best result. The best result is also a subjective thing. Sometimes you got to just trust your gut, trust your own instincts. So again, that has a lot to do with the relative nature of music as opposed to the absolute nature of music technology. So just to recap, a lot of why you might be having trouble dialing in good sounds on a compressor has to do with the following reasons. Number one, music is based in a world of relativity. Compressors are based in a world of absolutes. Reason number two, attack and release mean different things in music than they do in compressors. In music, attack and release is the start and stop of a note, and in compressors, attack and release is the amount of time after the event has happened does a compressor start working versus when it stops working. Reason number three, because of the dichotomy between the relative nature of music and the absolute nature of compressors, there are a few variables you need to consider every time you apply a compressor to an instrument on a song. You have to consider the compressor's parameters, right? What is a fast attack time and a slow attack time for that compressor? And the same thing with the release time. You have to consider how long is the transient, or how long is the actual attack of the signal you're trying to compress. Is it a drum? Is it a bowed instrument? Is it a vocalist? Is it a piano? What is it? And how long is the transient? That's going to have an effect on it. What is the tempo of the song? Because that's going to have an effect on how the performer interprets their part for that song. If it's very fast, you're not going to have a lot of time to draw out the attack of each note. You're going to have to get to it pretty quickly. If the song is slower, they might draw out the attack of each note, and you're going to have to adjust your compressor settings accordingly. So I hope that begins to shed some light on why you might be having trouble setting your compressor. If it's been helpful, let me know. If you have any questions, hit me up in the comments. And if you do find this useful, then by all means, please subscribe so I can send you more great stuff. You'll get notifications when I post something new. And I look forward to seeing you in the next video.